You have ever wondered why in the official Luftwaffe reports for 1944 there exists a gap that aviation historians shamefully avoid? Why did Goering's best aces, who had hundreds of sorties to their credit, suddenly begin writing reports resembling the ravings of a madman, and then were immediately grounded with a diagnosis of nervous exhaustion? In the archives that were declassified literally just days ago lies a folder without a title, only with a serial number. And the first document in it is a report from a reconnaissance Focke-Wulf pilot, dated the 4th of June, 1944. The pilot, flying over a square of railway and forested terrain in the west, reports visual contact with an object that fits into no laws of physics or logic. He writes that he saw how a gigantic mountain of steel, shrouded in clouds of strange, unnatural steam, dissolved into the air 3 seconds before he pressed the trigger of the photo machine gun. On the developed film, there is emptiness, only rails and morning fog. But the most terrible thing was in the postscript to the report, made with a trembling hand. It was looking at me. The German command then considered that the pilot was overtired, but they did not know that this phantom had already signed the death sentence for their main pride. We are accustomed to thinking that the war of machines is tanks and aircraft. But what if I tell you that the main duel of the Second World War occurred not in the sky and not in the field, but on a narrow strip of rails, where two monsters met, whose existence was denied by both sides? One was the embodiment of Nazi grandeur and was called Adolf Hitler. The other was assembled from fury, hunger, and stolen technologies, and its name was Ilya Muromets. Today we will conduct our own investigation and try to understand how Soviet engineers managed to create a fortress that violated the laws of gravity, and why the Germans, upon seeing it, threw down their weapons and fled without even trying to resist. To understand the nature of this phenomenon, we need to rewind time backward. 1941, the deep rear, the city of Murom, railway depot. Official history states that the armored train was built on the initiative of workers in their free time from work. It sounds beautiful, patriotic, but let us be honest, it sounds impossible. To build a super-heavy combat unit without blueprints, without financing, on bare enthusiasm. Here lies the first mystery that makes one doubt the official version. In the found diaries of one of the workshop masters who supervised welding, there are strange entries. He writes that blueprints did exist after all, but they did not come from the People's Commissariat of Defense. They were brought by strange people in civilian clothes who never gave their names. And these blueprints were executed on paper with watermarks that were not used in the Soviet Union. Where did they come from? Was this industrial espionage, or development seized from the enemy even before the war began? The master writes that the units and assemblies were arranged so tightly that inside the train there was practically no room left for people. This was a machine not for living. This was a machine for killing, where the crew was merely an appendage to the mechanism. The atmosphere in the depot was tense. People worked 20 hours a day, ate empty gruel, slept right by the machines, covering themselves with oil-soaked rags. But in their eyes burned a fanatical fire. They knew they were building something special. The main problem was armor. Ordinary steel would not do. Protection was needed that would withstand a direct hit from the German 88, the most terrible gun of that time, which pierced tanks through and through. And here a gap appears in the history. In the material supply documents it is indicated sheet steel 45 millimeters. But any metallurgist will tell you that a simple sheet of steel is not enough. And here we find testimony that changes everything. In a letter to his wife that was never sent, one of the engineers mentions that they used experimental hardening. They cooked a sandwich, a layer of viscous steel, a layer of concrete,
and steel again. The concrete dampened vibration and shock waves, while the steel held the fragments. But where in 1941 in provincial Murom did technologies of composite armor come from, which would appear in the world only 30 years later? Who suggested this solution to them?
The answer possibly lies in the identity of the chief designer, whose name in most documents is covered with black ink. But protection is only half the battle. The train must move, and the weight turned out to be colossal. 1,200 tons. Just think about this figure. 1,200 tons of metal, ammunition, and people. An ordinary locomotive of the O series simply would not move this hulk from its place. Its wheels would spin in place, grinding the rails into shavings. A special locomotive was needed, and they found one, but not at a factory, but at a train graveyard. An old, decommissioned locomotive that was being prepared for remelting. Why precisely this one? Workers said that this locomotive had a soul. Mechanics went over it bolt by bolt. They increased the pressure in the boiler to critical values, risking an explosion at any second. This was a risk bordering on madness. Pressure gauges went off the scale. Needles pressed against the limiters. But the boiler held. They forced the engine as racing cars are forced. Only the stake here was not a cup, but life. And so when the body was welded and the engine roared like a wounded beast, a problem arose that could have put an end to the entire project. Smoke. A steam locomotive throws into the sky a column of black smoke that is visible for dozens of kilometers. For German spotters, this is the same as a target in a shooting gallery. Ilya Muromets would have been destroyed on its very first outing. It needed to be made invisible. And again, a brilliant, simple, and eerie solution. Engineers developed a closed-cycle system. Smoke was not thrown out through the chimney. It mixed with steam, and under enormous pressure went under the bottom of the train, spreading along the ground like fog. This is precisely what that German pilot saw. Not clouds, but an artificial curtain that hid the silhouette of the train. From the side, it seemed that a thundercloud was moving along the rails. Sound was also muffled. Exhaust was dispersed through special filters. Imagine. Night. Silence. And suddenly, from the darkness, without a single sound, a steel mountain emerges. The psychological effect was paralyzing. German soldiers in trenches fell into stupor. They did not hear the familiar clatter of wheels, did not see fire from the chimney. This was like magic, like devilry. But the most interesting thing in the design of Ilya Muromets is the absence of vibration. When firing from heavy guns, any armored train rocks. This is a law of physics. Recoil throws off the aim, and the second shot already flies wide. To hit accurately, one must wait until the train calms down. And this is time. And in war, time is death. Murom workers accomplished the impossible. They created a stabilization system that had no analogs in the world. No hydraulics, no electronics, only pure mechanics. They used a system of counterweights and pendulums hidden in the false sides of platforms. How they calculated this without computers, on slide rules, in their heads, remains a mystery. But the fact is documented. During tests, a glass of water was placed on the platform. After a salvo from all 4 guns, the water in the glass only slightly rippled but did not spill. The commission from Moscow was in shock. Generals did not believe their eyes. They looked for a trick, thought the glass was glued. But no. Ilya Muromets stood like a rock. This gave it a colossal advantage. It could conduct rapid fire, covering targets with jeweler's precision, while German trains spent precious minutes on stabilization after each shot. Now let us look inside. What did people feel locked in this steel box? The crew was selected not by questionnaires but by character.
People were needed who lacked claustrophobia and fear of death. Inside the combat cabin, there was exactly enough space to turn around.
Walls pressed in. Ventilation worked poorly. In summer, the temperature rose to 50 degrees. In winter, it dropped to -20. Walls were covered with frost, which, when shots were fired, showered down collars. But there was one detail in this train that was not written about in newspapers. This was a special connection between the crew and the machine. Veterans recalled that the train seemed to sense danger. It happened that the engineer, without command, would pull the brake, and a second later, right in front of the nose of the train, an aerial bomb would explode. If they had traveled one more meter, they would have been no more. What is this? Intuition? Or that very ghost in the mechanism? But let us return to the documents. In the German Abwehr archives for 42, alarming reports begin to appear. Spies report the appearance at the front of a shapeshifter train. The Germans declare a hunt. For the destruction of Ilya Muromets, a reward is announced. 10,000 Reichsmarks, an Iron Cross, and leave home. Special squadrons of Stuka dive bombers are transferred to the front. Their target is only rails and trains. German aces boast that they will smash the Russian Iron Piece to splinters in one pass. But a month passes. Another. 6 months. Ilya Muromets continues to fight. It appears where it is not expected, delivers a dagger strike, and disappears. How does it manage to escape from aviation? After all, a railway is a predictable route. There is nowhere to turn. The answer lies in the tactics developed by the train commander. They never stayed in one place. They moved in spurts. At night, a forced march of 100 kilometers. During the day, camouflage in dense forest or in industrial zones. The train was painted to match the terrain. In winter, it was white as snow. In summer, spotted like forest. In autumn, dirty yellow. The crew carried with them hundreds of branches, nets, tarpaulins. In 20 minutes, the gigantic train turned into a hill overgrown with bushes. From the air, it was indistinguishable from the landscape. But once luck almost turned away from them. This happened in the spring of 43. Intelligence reported that the train's route had been calculated. The Germans prepared a trap. They mined the tracks and placed in ambush a battery of heavy howitzers. It seemed the end was predetermined. The train was going straight into a trap. The engineer saw ahead a strange gleam on the rails. This was wire from a detonator. Seconds remained until the explosion. Too late to brake. Inertia would drag the train right onto the mines. And then the engineer made a decision that contradicted all instructions. He did not brake. He gave full speed. He opened the valves fully, letting superheated steam into the cylinders. Wheels spun madly. The train lunged forward like a shell. Speed exceeded all permissible norms. They flew over the mines so fast that the fuse triggered late. The explosion sounded behind, only showering the last car with earth and fragments. German artillerymen in ambush were dumbfounded. They were waiting for a slow, cautious target, and past them raced something at the speed of an express train, pouring lead at them from machine guns. While they were turning their guns, the train had already disappeared around the bend. This was a triumph of speed and audacity. However, the main weapon of Ilya Muromets was still ahead. Engineers were preparing a surprise that was to change the rules of the game. Until 44, the armored train was armed with standard guns, but at the beginning of 44, it went for modernization. It returned different. Externally, nothing had changed. The same turrets, the same armored sides, but inside, death was hidden. The Germans could not even imagine that the Russians would think to mount on a railway platform rocket multiple launch systems, Katyushas. But not simply mount them. but hide them so that they would not be visible until the very last moment. This was a technical puzzle. The rocket jet of a Katyusha burns everything around. How to fire from a train and not burn the train itself? How to protect the ammunition from detonation? A solution was found, and it was as elegant as it was risky. And it was precisely this hidden weapon that was to play a decisive role in the upcoming meeting that had already been inscribed by fate. A meeting with the one whose name caused trembling even among their own, with the armored train, Adolf Hitler. Rumors about the German supertrain had circulated for a long time. It was said that it was finished inside with mahogany, that officers there had baths with hot water, and guns capable of reaching a target 20 kilometers away. This was the Führer's personal project, a symbol of the invincibility of the Reich. And these two symbols, one assembled by the hands of hungry workers in a coal depot, and the other created by the best Krupp concerns using slave labor from all of Europe, were inexorably converging. This was not just war. This was a personal vendetta. The Germans knew about Muromets. The Soviet crew knew about Hitler. They searched for each other on maps, probed the airwaves, waited for a mistake. And a mistake occurred. At the beginning of June 1944, the German command decided to use its flagship to strike an important transport hub. They were confident that in this area the Russians had nothing that could stop such power. Aviation was not flying due to weather. Tanks were bogged down in swamps. The railway was the only artery, and through this artery flowed poison in the form of an armored monster with a swastika on its side. But they did not know that towards them through fog and rain was already moving Ilya Muromets, and its commander held his finger on the button that would activate a mechanism not described in any German handbook. The atmosphere was heating up. The airwaves were silent, but this was the calm before the storm. Scouts who returned from a mission reported, "We saw fresh tracks on the rails, deep dents on the rails, speaking of the monstrous weight of the train that had passed, fuel oil stains, the smell of expensive German tobacco on the sleepers." The enemy was somewhere nearby. It was breathing down their necks. It was waiting. And Ilya Muromets accepted the challenge. The crew changed into clean clothes. This is an old Russian tradition before a mortal battle, to put on a clean shirt. No one spoke loud words. Everyone understood. From this duel, only one would return, or no one. Into the furnace flew the last reserves of select coal. Pressure in the boiler rose to the red line. The phantom train went on the hunt, and the fog swirling over the forests of western Belarus became its ally. But none of them even suspected that this battle would become not just a shootout, but an event that would become overgrown with legends, and that the denouement would be so swift and destructive that even the earth itself would shudder with pain. Ahead was a turn, and beyond this turn history awaited them. The silence of the Wolfschanze headquarters was more terrible than artillery fire. Wehrmacht generals stood at attention, afraid to raise their eyes to the man who nervously paced along a huge map of railway communications of the Eastern Front. The Führer was in a rage. His fingers squeezed a pencil so hard that it crunched and broke in half. The reason for his anger was invisible but tangible. In the sector of Army Group Center, something inexplicable was happening. Trains with tigers and panthers going to the front turned into piles of burning metal without reaching the front line. Bridges that were guarded by reinforced SS battalions exploded into the air precisely at the moment when a train with ammunition entered them. And in all reports, the same thing appeared. The attack was carried out by an unknown object that appeared from nowhere and disappeared into nowhere. German intelligence, the Abwehr, famed for its meticulousness, this time was powerless. They intercepted radio messages, but heard in the airwaves only a strange noise resembling the breathing of a huge beast and snatches of folk songs. This was mockery. This was a challenge.
And then a decision was made that was long considered a myth. Order number 31/403, to create a special group of hunters. Their goal was one: to find and destroy the Soviet armored train, which had already received the codename Green Ghost in German headquarters.
But to hunt a monster, another monster was needed. Even more terrifying, even more powerful. This is exactly how the story begins of the creation of that very train that was supposed to become the executioner of Ilya Muromets. If the Soviet train was a child of improvisation and workers' ingenuity, then its opponent, the armored train Adolf Hitler, was the pinnacle of dark Germanic genius. Documents about its construction were found in the archives of the Krupp concern only in the late 1990s, and they are staggering to the imagination. This was not simply a means of transport. This was a land battleship. The engineers of the Reich approached the task with maniacal thoroughness. They took as a basis platforms for transporting super-heavy naval guns. Each axle was reinforced with titanium alloys to withstand the weight of armor, which in its chemical composition resembled the plating of the battleship Tirpitz. The thickness of the sheets in the frontal part of the locomotive reached 80 millimeters. This made it invulnerable to any field artillery. Shells from Soviet 45s and even 76-millimeter guns simply bounced off it like peas off a wall, not even leaving dents. But protection was only part of the plan. The main thing was armament. The Germans installed on the platform 4 anti-aircraft turrets with automatic flak cannons, which created an impenetrable dome of fire around the train. Not a single IL-2 Sturmovik could approach it closer than a kilometer. But the most ominous element was 2 heavy howitzers of 150-millimeter caliber removed from a damaged cruiser. These monsters could hurl shells weighing 40 kilograms at distances up to 20 kilometers. This meant that Adolf Hitler could destroy Ilya Muromets without even entering visual contact with it. It only needed coordinates, and for this, the newest Würzburg radar station was installed on the train. A dish that rotated on a special platform behind the locomotive. This was the technology of tomorrow, transferred to rails. An electronic eye that could see through fog, rain, and night. The Germans were confident the Russians had no chance. This was a battle of a stone axe against a laser sight. However, technology is nothing without people. The crew of the German supertrain was selected personally by Reichsführer SS Himmler. These were not just soldiers. These were fanatics who had undergone training in elite saboteur schools. Each of them had behind them experience of battles in Africa, France, in the Balkans. The conditions of their life on the train differed radically from what the Soviet railway workers had. If the crew of Muromets slept in a heap on boxes of shells, then in the German train there were equipped compartments with soft bunks, shower cabins, and even a restaurant car with supplies of French cognac and chocolate. Officers ate from porcelain dishes with silver utensils. This was a feast during the plague, a demonstration of the superiority of the master race even in everyday life. But behind this gloss hid animal fear. In the found diaries of one of the German radio operators, there is an entry: "We live like kings, but sleep with open eyes. Every time the train stops at night in the forest, it seems to me that the trees are moving. The Russians are somewhere nearby. I can smell them." The confrontation moved into the phase of spy warfare. Soviet counterintelligence Smersh received information about the appearance of a new player on the chessboard. The agent network reported the movement of a strange train that moved only at night and was guarded better than trains with gold, but no one knew what it looked like. The Germans applied unprecedented masking measures. During the day, the train was driven into special hangars or covered with camouflage nets of such density that from the air it looked like an ordinary hill. The name of the train changed in documents every day. Today it was Berlin, tomorrow Wotan, the day after tomorrow Siegfried. This was a shell game where the stake was the lives of thousands of people. Soviet command understood that if this monster reached operational space, it could cut key supply arteries of the front. It was necessary to act preemptively. But how to strike at what you cannot see? And here begins an episode worthy of a separate thriller. An episode about which they were silent for 50 years. Soviet saboteurs received an order to capture a prisoner from among those who serviced the German armored train. A group of 6 people went behind enemy lines. They dissolved into forests and swamps, becoming shadows. For a week they lay in mud by the railway embankment, observing the movement schedule. Hundreds of trains passed by, with coal, with infantry, with equipment. But there was no target. And then on the 8th night, the earth trembled. At first it was a fine vibration from which water in puddles began to ripple. Then a sound appeared, low, guttural rumbling, unlike the clatter of ordinary wheels. A black silhouette emerged from the darkness. It was enormous. It was absolutely dark. Not a single light, not a single spark. Only the dim reflection of the moon on gun barrels. The saboteurs understood. This was it. The group commander made an insane decision. To attack the train on the move was impossible, but the train had to stop at the water tower. This was the only chance. The operation lasted exactly 3 minutes. 3 minutes that decided the fate of the entire hunt. When the train braked at the water tower, Soviet scouts silently took out the sentries. This was an art brought to automatism. Not a sound, not a splash. They made their way to the last car. The door was ajar. Inside was a technician checking the axle boxes. A blow, a bag over the head, and the body was already flying into the bushes. But then the unforeseen happened. A German shepherd sleeping in the neighboring compartment sensed a stranger. Barking tore through the night silence. Searchlights flared up. The siren howled so that it blocked the ears. The group was exposed. A battle began. German submachine gunners poured out of the cars like peas. A hail of fire pressed the scouts to the ground. There was nowhere to retreat. Behind was a swamp. Ahead, a wall of lead. It would seem the end. Failure. But the group commander, understanding that they would not leave alive, did what the Germans did not expect at all. He pulled out a signal flare gun and fired, but not into the sky. He fired directly into the open door of the car from which soldiers were jumping. The flare, hissing and scattering sparks, flew inside and hit a box of signal smokes. The car instantly filled with acrid, thick orange smoke. The Germans in panic began to jump out, coughing and tearing up. Confusion arose. Taking advantage of this second of confusion, the saboteurs rushed to the forest, dragging the captured technician with them. They left under a hail of bullets, weaving between trees. 2 remained lying there, by the embankment, covering the retreat of their comrades. Their names are still unknown. There are no crosses on their graves, only old pines rustle above them. But the task was completed. The prisoner was delivered to their side. The interrogation of the technician gave shocking information. It turned out that Adolf Hitler was not just an armored train. This was a mobile laboratory. In one of the cars was equipment for listening to radio ether for hundreds of kilometers around. They knew about every movement of Soviet troop, but the most terrible thing was not this. The technician, trembling with fear and nicotine, told that the train was carrying some special cargo. Cargo that was guarded by people in white coats and gas masks. Even the crew was forbidden to approach this car. It had its own ventilation system, its own generators. What was there? New biological weapons? Atomic components? The technician did not know.
He only saw how once at night during loading, one of the containers tilted slightly, and the Geiger counter of the guard officer began to crackle like mad. This information changed everything. Now the destruction of the German train became a task of strategic importance. It was no longer about a duel of two armored machines, but about preventing a possible catastrophe. At front headquarters, they developed Operation Trap. The idea was simple and brilliant: to lure the beast from its lair. But how to force the super-cautious commander of the German train to come out onto an open section?
It was necessary to give him bait from which he could not refuse. Soviet engineers in 2 days built a mock-up. They took ordinary freight platforms, sheathed them with plywood and cardboard, painted them to look like armor, and installed mock-ups of guns from logs on top. From a distance, it looked like an exact copy of Ilya Muromets. This fake train was assigned the same call sign. Messages flew into the ether, supposedly from the commander of the armored train, with reports of a breakdown and forced stop at Kovel 2 station. The radio game began. Soviet radio operators imitated panic. Boiler breakdown, standing without motion, need help. The Germans intercepted these messages. Abwehr analysts checked the data. The radio operator's handwriting matched. The codes were correct. The fish bit. The commander of Adolf Hitler could not miss such a chance. To destroy the legendary Russian armored train while it was helpless and standing for repairs. This was an iron cross with oak leaves and personal gratitude from the Fuhrer. The German giant began moving. It left its hiding place in the forests and headed toward Kovel. It went at full speed, sweeping away everything in its path. But it did not know that the real Ilya Muromets was standing in a completely different place, camouflaged in dense spruce forest 5 kilometers from the station. And its crew was already lubricating the guides for rocket projectiles with thick graphite grease. But here fate again intervened in people's plans. The weather deteriorated. A thunderstorm began of such force that the sky turned into a continuous flash of lightning. Rain poured in a wall. Visibility dropped to 0. Radio communication was interrupted. Static in the ether drowned out everything. Operation Trap was on the verge of failure. Observers did not see the German train. The sound of its engines drowned in the peals of thunder. Where was it? Had it passed the control point or stopped, sensing something wrong? Everyone's nerves were at the limit. The commander of Ilya Muromets stood in the open hatch of the cabin, exposing his face to icy streams of rain, and listened into the night. He tried to hear what instruments could not catch. The intuition of an experienced railway worker told him, the enemy is close. He felt the vibration of the rails with the soles of his boots. This vibration was alien. The rhythm of the wheels was different, heavier, more frequent. And suddenly, in a flash of lightning, a silhouette appeared for a moment. It was far away on a parallel branch separated from the main one by a strip of forest. The German armored train was going on the wrong path. Intelligence had made a mistake. The Germans at the last moment changed the route. They were going around the trap straight into the rear of the Soviet grouping. The situation turned upside down. Now the hunter became the victim. If Adolf Hitler broke through, it would reach undefended supply stations and arrange a massacre there. Ilya Muromets had only minutes left to make a decision. It was necessary to intercept the enemy, but for this it would be necessary to leave the ambush, reveal itself, and enter battle on unfavorable conditions, on meeting courses, where the advantage would be with whoever had thicker armor and more powerful guns. And by these parameters, the German exceeded the Soviet train many times over. Inside the Soviet armored train, feverish work began. Stokers threw coal at such speed that shovels flickered like propellers. Dampers roared, steam pressure rose. Ilya Muromets trembled, shaking off masking branches, and slowly, like a waking dragon, crawled onto the embankment. Stealth was cast aside. Now everything was decided by speed. They had to reach the switch before the Germans to block their path. This was a race with death to the accompaniment of a thunderstorm. Two steel leviathans rushed through the night forest, closing in with each second. The distance was shrinking. 5 kilometers. 3. The crew heard the rumble of the German train even through the noise of rain. This was a terrible sound. The howl of turbines and the clank of track links with which the sides of the German train were hung for additional protection. And at this time in the headquarters car of Adolf Hitler, calm reigned. Officers drank coffee, discussing the upcoming easy victory. They were confident they were going to finish off a wounded beast. The Würzburg radar was turned off because of the storm. Operators feared that lightning would strike the antenna. They were blind, relying only on their confidence in the power of armor. They did not know that several kilometers from them, on an intercept course, was rushing not a plywood mock-up, but 1,000 tons of fury. And that in the barrels of Soviet guns, armor-piercing shells were already being loaded, on which the names of fallen comrades were written in chalk. The drama was building. No one yet knew that this night would be the last for one of them. In one of the sections of the Soviet train where the Katyushas were located, the gunner, a young guy from the suburbs, for the 10th time checked the contacts of the electric trigger. His hands were dry and hot despite the cold. He knew that everything depended on his actions. The guidance system was primitive but reliable. But to fire rocket projectiles in such a downpour was a risk. Water could short-circuit the contacts. Powder could get damp. If the rockets did not leave the guides, they would explode right inside the car, blowing the train to splinters. This was a one-way ticket. The battery commander walked through the car, looking into the eyes of each soldier. He said nothing, only slapped shoulders. Looks said more than words. "Hold on, son, don't tremble. We'll get them." And then ahead appeared the lights of the semaphore. That very crossing, that very crossroads of fates. Ilya Muromets flew onto the embankment first with a screech of brakes, blocking the path. Sparks flew in sheaves from under the wheels. It stood across the road, blocking movement. 30 seconds later, Adolf Hitler appeared from around the bend. The German engineer, seeing an obstacle before him, pulled the emergency brake lever, but the inertia of the enormous mass was inexorable. The train continued to rush forward, sliding on wet rails. The distance was closing rapidly. Now they saw each other. The light of searchlights crossed. Two ideologies, two technologies, two worlds converged on a narrow strip of land in the middle of Belarusian swamps. Time stopped. That very second of silence before the storm arrived, when you can hear a drop of rain falling and a heart beating in a ribcage. But this was not just a meeting. This was the beginning of the end for the legend that Nazi propagandists had so carefully created. And none of those present even suspected what surprise the Soviet crew had prepared in case ordinary shells did not penetrate the German armor. A surprise that was in a simple wooden box under the commander's bunk, and about which only 2 people on the entire train knew. 2 searchlights cut through the wall of rain, crossing at one point like the swords of duelists. This was not just a meeting on the tracks. This was a moment when time seemed to compress into a tight spring. The distance between the locomotives was less than 800 meters. For modern warfare, this is the distance of a pistol shot. But for 2 armored giants weighing 1,000 tons, this was the distance of death's kiss. The German Adolf Hitler was majestic and terrible. His towers slowly rotated, barrels lowering, searching for vulnerable spots in the Soviet train's armor. It seemed that physics itself was on the German side. Their optics were better. Their mechanisms worked more smoothly. Their crew was honed by years of victories in Europe. They looked at the Soviet composition as prey, like a clumsy bear that had accidentally wandered into a clearing where hunters waited. But they did not see the main thing. They did not see what was happening inside Ilya Muromets behind the thick sheets of armored steel, where the air was electrified to the limit, and people worked with the precision of clockwork, understanding that they would not have a second chance. In the combat control room of the Soviet armored train stood deathly silence, broken only by the commander's hoarse breathing and the ticking of a stopwatch. He understood that in a classical artillery duel they had no chance. The German 50mm howitzers would turn them into a sieve in 2 salvos. Muromets' armor would withstand the first strike, perhaps the second, but the kinetic energy of the German shells would simply tear the turrets from their rings. They needed to act unconventionally. They needed to break all the rules of railway combat. And the commander gave an order that made the gunners' chests go cold. Do not open fire with the guns. Prepare the main caliber. This was madness. To wait while the Germans took aim, to give them a head start of precious seconds. But the calculation was subtle and cruel. The commander knew the Germans were pedantic. They needed time for precise aiming, for calculating corrections for wind, for humidity. They would not shoot at random. They would want to destroy the Russian train with one beautiful demonstration strike. And it was precisely this German pedantry that became their trap. At this moment, inside the armored cars of Muromets, something was happening that was in no manual. Mechanics were breaking the seals on the hydraulic system levers. Usually, preparation for a salvo from reactive mortars took about 5 minutes. It was necessary to remove the stoppers, raise the guides, check the contacts. They had 30 seconds. 30 seconds while the German gunners turned the flywheels of their sights. This was a race not for speed, but for survival. If the mechanism jammed, if even one gear, made at an evacuated factory by half-starved teenagers, failed, they were all dead. Only the screech of metal and the heavy breathing of people tearing their nails while tightening clamps could be heard. And then the roof of one of the armored cars shuddered. It began to slowly, treacherously slowly, part to the sides. Electric motors howled from overload. From the bowels of the car, like the sting of a giant insect, the guide rails of the Katyusha began to rise. The Germans saw this. Through their optical sights, they noticed movement on the roof of the Russian train, but they did not understand what it was. Their instructions described nothing like this. What were these Russians doing? Surrendering? Raising a white flag? Or releasing some kind of smoke? The confusion in the German control room lasted only a few seconds. The fire control officer frowned, trying to classify the threat. These seconds were enough. The guides locked into combat position. The elevation angle was minimal. Fire was conducted practically by direct aiming. This was categorically forbidden by all manuals. The N-13 reactive shells were not designed for point-blank fire. They might not have time to stabilize, might go into the ground, might explode from impact in the air, but no one was thinking about instructions. The battery commander, a young lieutenant with a bandaged head, simply pressed the trigger. What happened next, witnesses described as the opening of the gates of hell. The air was torn by a terrible drilling howl that burst eardrums. Fiery arrows tore from the guides, enveloping the Soviet train in a cloud of smoke and flame. This was not a single shot. This was a barrage. Dozens of rockets went toward the target almost simultaneously, merging into a solid stream of fire. The German officer in the control room of Adolf Hitler only had time to widen his eyes. He saw not shells. He saw a wall of fire that was advancing on them at the speed of sound. Time stopped for them. They did not even have time to press the triggers of their guns. The reactive shells covered the German armored train 1.5 seconds after the salvo. The physics of destruction was monstrous. The first shell hit at the base of the forward artillery turret. The explosion was of such force that the turret weighing 40 tons was simply blown off the platform like a hat by the wind. It flew over the locomotive and crashed into the swamp, raising a column of mud. But this was only the beginning. The remaining rockets hit in a cluster, ripping open the plating, tearing off armor plates, turning the insides of the cars into a fiery mess. One of the shells pierced the tender with water and coal, and immediately the next one detonated. Superheated steam from the torn communications mixed with fire. The people inside the German train did not even have time to feel pain. The temperature at the epicenter of the explosion jumped to 1,000 degrees instantly. The armored steel did not melt, it evaporated. But the fatal blow was not delivered to the guns. One of the rockets, as if guided by an invisible hand of fate, hit precisely in the locomotive's boiler, in the place where steam pressure reached critical values. The effect was similar to the explosion of a small-radius tactical nuclear bomb. The boiler was torn from the inside. The gigantic force ripped apart the steel body of the locomotive, turning it inside out. The wheel sets, weighing tons, flew apart, cutting down century-old pines like matches. The blast wave went along the composition, tearing cars from the rails, crushing them like an accordion. Adolf Hitler, the pride of the Reich, symbol of invincibility, ceased to exist as a combat unit in 4 seconds. In its place remained only a blazing pile of metal from which columns of black, greasy smoke erupted. Ilya Muromets stood on the tracks, shrouded in powder smoke. His crew was silent. No one shouted hurrah. Everyone was deafened. People looked through the viewing slits and did not believe their eyes. There where a minute ago stood a steel leviathan, now was a lake of fire. Rain hissed, evaporating on the red-hot metal of the wreckage. The commander slowly lowered his binoculars. His hands were trembling. He understood that they had just accomplished the impossible. They had cheated death. But it was too early to relax. It was necessary to make sure that the enemy was completely destroyed. And most importantly, it was necessary to check what the scouts had talked about. That very secret car. Had it survived in this hell? A special group of Soviet soldiers jumped down the embankment, boots squelched in mud mixed with fuel oil and fragments. The heat from the burning train could be felt 100 meters away. They approached the remains of the German composition cautiously, holding their automatic weapons at the ready. Who knows who might have survived in the tail of the train? But there was no resistance. Around lay twisted parts, scraps of uniforms, melted weapons. The picture was apocalyptic, as if a giant hammer had struck the train from above, flattening it against the ground. The soldiers advanced to the center of the composition, to where, according to intelligence data, the headquarters car and that very special cargo should have been located. And then they found it. Among the chaos of destruction, one car looked strangely intact. It had been torn from its bogies. It lay on its side, half sunk into the marshy soil, but its body was not torn open. This was a solid cast container without windows, with a very thick door, resembling a safe door. On the side, barely visible, were the remains of markings. A red eagle and some numbers, not like standard army indices. The metal of the car was cold. This was anomalous. Around raged flames, the plating of neighboring platforms burned, and this car seemed to radiate cold. The soldiers exchanged glances. The group commander approached the door. There was no handle, only a wheel, like on a submarine. He tried to turn it. It was jammed. "Crowbar here!" he shouted, trying to shout over the noise of the fire. 2 soldiers worked with crowbars. The metal screeched. The door, weighing probably half a ton, reluctantly yielded. From inside came not the smell of burning or stuffiness. From there came ozone, such a sharp smell as happens during a thunderstorm or in an X-ray room. The darkness inside the car turned out to be thick, almost tangible. The commander shone inside with a captured flashlight. The beam of light snatched from the darkness strange devices, broken scales, bundles of wires and another container. Smaller in size, lead, sealed tight. It was chained to the floor. Next to it lay a man in a white coat, dead. But there were no visible wounds on him. His face was distorted by a grimace of horror, and his hands clutched a folder with documents so tightly that his fingers had turned white. The group commander, an experienced scout who had been through Stalingrad, felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Instinct, developed by years of war, screamed, "Leave! Don't touch!" But an order is an order. He stepped inside, trying not to step on the strange slime covering the floor. He bent down to the dead scientist and tore the folder from his hands. On the cover was a stamp of highest secrecy and a strange seal, a black circle with lightning. This was not the emblem of the SS or Wehrmacht. This was something else, a division they had never heard of. At this moment, the sound of motors was heard from outside. German reinforcements? No, the sound was different. Willa's jeeps and trucks were approaching the crash site. This was an NKVD group that had been following the armored train, remaining in the shadows. They appeared so quickly, as if they had been waiting for precisely this moment. People in leather coats and uniforms with cornflower blue collar tabs jumped out of the vehicles. They acted harshly and quickly, cordoned off the crash area, drove away the soldiers of the armored train. The NKVD group commander, a colonel with cold fish eyes, approached the car. He did not even glance at the burning German train. He was interested only in this container.
"Everyone move back 100 meters, he commanded in a voice that brooked no objection.
"Forget everything you saw here. This battle did not happen. This car does not exist." The soldiers exchanged glances. They had just destroyed Hitler's pride, and they were being ordered to forget. But to argue with the NKVD in 1944 was tantamount to suicide. Muromet's crew was led to their composition. They saw from a distance how the Chekists pulled out the lead box, loaded it into a covered truck with reinforced guard, and immediately rushed off into the darkness. The colonel took the folder with documents personally, hiding it in his briefcase so quickly as if it burned his hands. The remaining skeleton of the German car was doused with something from canisters and set on fire. The flame flared up with a strange greenish color, devouring the evidence. In 10 minutes, only a melted skeleton remained of the secret laboratory. Ilya Muromets was leaving the battle site in reverse.
It needed to return to a safe section. Inside the train reigned a strange mood, the joy of victory mixed with anxiety. They had won, yes, but they had touched a secret that was clearly bigger than just a war between two armies. The engineer, looking at the gauges, noticed a strangeness. After they had stood near the German car, the instrument needles began to behave inadequately. The compass spun like a top. The watches of the entire crew stopped exactly at the moment when they opened the German car. 3 hours 42 minutes. This was like the effect of a powerful magnetic field or something else, the nature of which was unknown to them. At the next station they were already being waited for, but not by an orchestra and flowers. They were waited for by special officers. Endless interrogations began. Each crew member wrote an explanation, what they saw, what they heard, whether they entered the German car. Non-disclosure agreements were taken under signature. Any leak of information was punishable by execution.
The official version for Information Bureau reports was dry. At one of the front sections, a large enemy train with ammunition was destroyed. Not a word about Adolf Hitler, not a word about the duel, not a word about the strange cargo. The story was rewritten and cleaned up that same day. However, there are things that are impossible to hide completely. Rumors, like water, find cracks. In the repair workshops where Ilya Muromets arrived for maintenance, workers whispered. They saw strange marks on the train's armor. These were not marks from fragments. In some places, the metal had changed structure. It had become brittle, like glass. as if the train had been under the influence of unknown radiation that had aged the metal by hundreds of years in a few minutes. Chemical analysis conducted by the factory laboratory showed the presence of isotopes that do not occur in nature. The analysis results were immediately confiscated, and the laboratory assistant who conducted it was unexpectedly transferred to another factory in the Urals, and contact with him was broken. So what was in that container? Why did Hitler risk his best armored train so much, sending it into a dangerous zone? Some researchers comparing facts put forward a bold hypothesis. In 1944, Germany was feverishly searching for Wunderwaffe, wonder weapons. Developments were conducted in different directions: atomic bomb, jet aviation, V-2 ballistic missiles. But there was also another project about which very little is known. Project Glocke, or Bell, a device allegedly capable of manipulating gravity and time. Testimonies say that during tests of this device, strange phenomena occurred: glow, freezing of liquids, death of plants. The description of effects surprisingly coincides with what the soldiers saw at the destroyed car: cold, ozone, stopped watches. Is it possible that Adolf Hitler was transporting a prototype engine for disc aircraft, which, according to legends, were being developed in the depths of Wenceslas? Or was this a component for a dirty bomb with which the Nazis planned to stop the Red Army's advance? We do not know the exact answer, but we know what happened to the people who looked into that abyss. The reconnaissance group commander who first entered the car died 6 months after the war. Diagnosis: acute leukemia. The disease burned him up in 2 weeks. Other soldiers from that group also left life suspiciously early, some from strange blood diseases, some as a result of accidents, as if some force was cleaning up witnesses, erasing the memory of that morning near Kovel. But they managed to tell something to their loved ones in whispers in kitchens. Years later, they spoke of light that was darker than night, and the sensation that inside that car someone was there, someone alive, but not human. Ilya Muromets continued his path to Berlin. He became a legend, a ghost whom the Germans feared. But the crew changed. People became withdrawn, gloomy. They bore the seal of secrecy. They knew that their victory was not only the defeat of the enemy, but also a touch of something forbidden. And every time the train entered fog, it seemed to them that from the whitish veil, the very same black eagle from the destroyed German car was looking at them. The war of machines ended, but another war began. A war for secrets that can destroy the world faster than any tank. And in this war, the armored train Ilya Muromets became an unwitting keeper of a key that the special services of all world powers were seeking. But where is this key now? Did it burn in the furnace of history? Or does it lie in some forgotten special storage, awaiting its hour? The answer may be closer than we think. After the duel near Kovel, the story of the armored train Ilya Muromets should have followed the familiar scenario of heroic chronicle. Repair, replenishment of ammunition, new battles, and the path to Berlin. But what happened with the composition and its crew in the following months more resembled the script of a psychological horror than military documentary. In the declassified medical records of crew members, dated July 1944, strange entries began to appear. These were not wounds from shrapnel or concussions. This was an unknown pathology. People who had lived in harmony with iron and coal for years suddenly began to fear their own train. Field hospital doctors recorded symptoms in the soldiers similar to radiation sickness, about which few people knew at that time. Hair loss, bleeding gums, constant nausea, and an inexplicable feeling of panic fear that came in waves. As soon as they approached the armor closer than 5 meters, but there were no dosimeters in ordinary units at that time, and the diagnosis given was standard:
combat fatigue. However, the whispers in the barracks grew louder. They said that the train had become infected, that after contact with that German wagon and its contents, the metal of Muromets had absorbed something alien, something evil. The strangeness continued at the repair depot in liberated Minsk, where the train arrived to patch holes after battle. Welders, experienced men who could weld a seam even underwater, refused to work with the armored train's plating. They complained to management that the metal was behaving unnaturally. When attempting to apply a patch to a breach, the old armor began to sweat. Drops of oily, reddish liquid appeared on the surface, which instantly evaporated with the smell of sulfur. Electrodes melted without producing an arc, or conversely, flared up with blinding violet light, burning through the metal completely where it should have been strongest.
One of the masters wrote an insane phrase in his report. The metal rejects foreign steel as a living organism rejects a transplanted organ. Naturally, the master was accused of sabotage and sent to a penal battalion, but work came to a halt. In the end, the breaches were simply painted over, having failed to weld them. Ilya Muromets continued the war with unhealing wounds on its sides, which, according to eyewitnesses, glowed faintly at night. But the most inexplicable things began when the armored train entered Polish territory. Local residents, accustomed to the horrors of war, crossed themselves and locked their shutters when they heard the approach of this train. The sound of its movement had changed. It was no longer the rhythmic clatter of wheels. It was a low-frequency hum that made windows vibrate in houses 5 kilometers from the railway, and dogs went mad, breaking their chains. In the archives of the Polish resistance, reports have been preserved about a black dragon that passes through stations without stopping and leaves behind a trail of cold air in the middle of hot August. The temperature within a radius of 100 meters from the tracks after the train's passage dropped by 10 to 15 degrees. Water in wells froze. This contradicted all laws of thermodynamics. A heated locomotive should radiate heat, not cold. Soviet physicists studying these reports in the 1950s put forward a hypothesis that the train had possibly fallen into the zone of action of an unknown field generator that had been aboard the destroyed Adolf Hitler, and had now itself become a carrier of residual energy that sucked heat from the surrounding space. The culmination of this period was the story of the Yablanovsky Tunnel. This event is completely absent from the official chronicle of the train's combat path, but it is described in detail in the personal diary of the division's intelligence chief, who supervised the train's movements. In autumn 1944, Ilya Muromets was supposed to pass secretly through a long railway tunnel in the Carpathians to emerge on the flank of a German grouping. The tunnel had been checked by sappers. No mines were found. The tunnel's length was 3 kilometers. At a speed of 40 kilometers per hour, the train should have passed through it in 4.5 minutes. The train entered the tunnel portal at exactly 1400 hours. Fire controllers were waiting for it at the exit. 5 minutes passed. No train. 10 minutes passed. Silence. Communication with the crew was cut off instantly as soon as the last wagon disappeared into the darkness. 15 minutes. 20. Panic began to grip those waiting. A collapse, sabotage, but no explosion had been heard. The train emerged from the tunnel after 42 minutes, but it emerged not as it had entered. Fresh paint, which had been applied before the operation, had peeled and turned gray, as if not half an hour but half a century had passed. Metal handrails had rusted through to holes, but the most terrible thing was with the people. The crew, young lads, emerged into the light as old men. 20-year-old soldiers had gray hair. Their faces were covered with deep wrinkles, and in their eyes was frozen an expression of absolute emptiness. They did not remember what had happened in the tunnel. For them, the same 4 minutes had passed as should have. They had not noticed the delay,
but their biological clocks had run forward by a decade. The train commander, barely moving his tongue, reported the completion of the task, but his voice was the voice of a deep, old man. The train was immediately withdrawn to the rear.
The entire crew was discharged due to disability and sent to closed NKVD sanatoriums, where most of them died within a year from rapid aging of the organism. New people were recruited to replace them, volunteers. They were not told the truth. They were told that the previous crew had heroically died in battle. The new soldiers immediately felt that something was wrong with the train. Things disappeared and appeared in other places. At night, footsteps in German speech were heard in empty compartments. Mechanics swore that they saw in the locomotive's firebox not coals, but the faces of people distorted in screams. The train acquired a reputation as cursed, but it continued to fight, and it fought with some diabolical effectiveness. Shells fired from its guns landed on target with incredible accuracy, even without aiming. It seemed that the metal itself wanted to kill.
There were cases when guns fired spontaneously, without command, and these shots always found the enemy. A camouflaged tank, a sniper in a tree, a headquarters dugout. The train had turned into an autonomous combat unit possessing its own grim intelligence. In German headquarters, real hysteria began. They received reports that the Russian armored train was invulnerable. Shells hitting it did not explode. Bombs passed through it as through fog. Wehrmacht soldiers refused to take positions if they knew that the ghost was operating in the sector. A secret SS circular was issued forbidding direct visual contact with Soviet armored train number 762. It was recommended to call in aviation and cover the square with carpet bombing. But even this did not help. Luftwaffe pilots complained that navigation instruments went mad over the train. The compass spun, and the altimeter showed negative values, as if they were flying underground.
Several aircraft crashed under strange circumstances, simply crashing into the ground near the railway in clear weather. In the black boxes, or their equivalents of that time, recordings of the last minutes contained only that same low-frequency hum. By the winter of '45, Ilya Muromets had changed in appearance beyond recognition. This was no longer the neat and trim armored train that had left the gates of the Murom depot. This was a monster, overgrown with trophy armor that the crew welded over the old in an attempt to cover the glowing spots. It was hung with chains, sandbags, logs. On the front platform, someone had welded a huge bison skull found in the Białowieża forest. It looked like a totem, like an idol of barbarians. Political officers tried to force them to remove this obscurantism, but the crew stood firm. They believed that this skull frightened away the evil spirits that had settled in the train after the tunnel. Discipline on board became peculiar. This was not regulation army discipline, but the order of a pirate ship. They obeyed only their commander and the will of the train. High command turned a blind eye to this. As long as the train was destroying Germans in batches, its strangeness was tolerated. Victory was more important than regulations. Once, during a stop at a small Polish station, a local fortune teller approached the train. An old gypsy woman, seeing the black silhouette of the locomotive, suddenly fell to her knees and began to howl. She screamed that this train was carrying not soldiers but the souls of the dead, and that it would never stop, even when the war ended, that it was cursed to wander the rails forever until it atoned for the sin of touching forbidden knowledge. Soldiers chased the old woman away, but a residue remained. That same evening, one of the loaders had a nervous breakdown. He tried to blow himself up with a grenade in the artillery magazine, screaming that he heard voices from under the wagon floor demanding blood for the engine. They restrained him, but he had managed to pull the pin on the grenade. No explosion occurred. The fuse worked, but the detonator did not explode. Another miracle. Or had the train itself protected itself by suppressing the chemical reaction of the explosion?
We are approaching the solution to why this phenomenally effective combat mechanism was so hastily disbanded and destroyed immediately after victory. Not because it had become obsolete, but because it had become dangerous. Dangerous not to enemies, but to reality itself. Documents testify that in February 45, a group of scientists from Moscow arrived at front headquarters, led by a future academician whose surname is still classified.
They brought with them cumbersome equipment. The train was driven into a dead end, cordoned off by NKVD troops, and for 3 days they conducted measurements. Scientists walked around the wagons in lead suits. What did they find there? In the final report, there is a phrase that makes the blood run cold. Object 762 demonstrates signs of local distortion of the space-time continuum. Further operation poses a threat of a global nature. Complete isolation is recommended. That is, in simple words, the train had become a hole in reality. It was not emitting radiation. It was emitting time. That is why the crew aged. That is why shells flew where the train wanted. It was warping space around itself, and with each day this effect intensified. If in 44 it was minutes, then by 45 the radius of the anomaly could expand to kilometers. Imagine a weapon that does not simply kill the enemy, but erases him from time, or ages him to the state of dust in a second. This would be an absolute weapon, but it was uncontrollable. Soviet leadership, standing on the threshold of creating an atomic bomb, became frightened of what it could not understand. A decision was made to keep the train going until the end of the war, using its power to the maximum, and then get rid of it as quickly as possible before it caused trouble. But Ilya Muromets was not going to surrender just like that. It sensed the approach of the end. In the last battles on the approaches to Oder, it behaved like a mad beast. Ammunition expenditure exceeded all standards. The locomotive roared so loudly that pipes burst. It was as if it was trying to gorge itself on war for the last time. And then in Frankfurt on Oder, the last, most mysterious incident of its combat biography occurred. The train was supposed to support Soviet troops crossing with fire. The Germans resisted desperately. The bridge was blown up. Ilya Muromets rolled out onto the embankment and opened hurricane fire. And at that moment, according to the testimony of hundreds of soldiers, the train split in two. For a second, everyone saw two trains. One real, made of iron and dirt, firing at the enemy, and the second, ghostly, translucent, which broke away from the rails and went through the air over the water, straight at German positions. The Germans, seeing the flying train, threw down their weapons and ran. This psychological attack cost them the city. But when the smoke cleared, only one train stood on the tracks. It was heated to red hot. The paint on it had burned off completely, and it looked like a skeleton just pulled from a crematorium furnace. This was the beginning of the end. The order for disbandment had already been signed. But how do you destroy something that is perhaps no longer entirely material? How do you cut with an autogenous torch something that warps space? The task of disposing of the legend was assigned to a special engineering battalion. And this operation became the last battle of Ilya Muromets. A battle not with Germans, but with its own creators, who decided to kill their creation. But more about this in the following documents that we managed to obtain. From the archive with the classification Store Forever. The official order for the disbandment of the 31st Separate Armored Train Division, which included Ilya Muromets, was signed in July 1945. On paper, it looked like an ordinary bureaucratic procedure. The war had ended, the army was being reduced, old equipment was being written off. But what was happening on the reserve tracks near Murom, where the legendary train had been transferred, more closely resembled a secret execution than disposal.
Usually trains are dismantled calmly. Weapons are removed, valuable units are dismantled, and the body is cut for scrap metal. Here, however, everything was different. The territory was cordoned off with 3 rings of guards. Around the perimeter, towers with machine guns were set up, aimed not outward, but inward, at the train itself. Workers were brought from other regions, having had their passports taken away. They were forbidden to talk with locals. The atmosphere was such that it seemed they were preparing to dismantle not a locomotive, but an alien ship that could explode or fly away at any moment. The first stage was the removal of the Katyushas, those very secret installations that had decided the outcome of the duel with Adolf Hitler. Engineers who had come from Moscow worked in chemical protection suits. They feared not poison, they feared residual energy. When they began to unscrew the bolts fastening the guide rails, the inexplicable happened. Bolts, hardened in battles, burst on their own at the touch of a wrench, like glass. The metal groaned. Workers heard a hum coming from deep within the wagons, similar to a low growl. One of the engineers, a young fellow, suddenly fainted. When he was brought to his senses, he muttered something incoherent about black threads swirling that stretched from the train to the sky. He was immediately taken away, and no one saw him again. The installations were eventually cut off with an autogenous torch along with pieces of the roof loaded into lead containers and taken to the Kapustin Yar test site. They say that during their remelting, the furnace broke down. The crucible cracked and molten metal flowed out, forming on the workshop floor a strange pattern resembling a star map. The next step was the disarmament of the artillery turrets, and here, Ilya Muromets showed its character. When a cutter was brought to the main caliber turret, the turret turned by itself, without crew, without power supply. It slowly, with a screech, turned the barrel directly at the group of workers. People fled in terror. Security officers opened fire on the turret with automatic weapons. Bullets ricocheted off the armor, striking sparks. But this was as useless as shooting at a mountain. The train was alive. Some phantom energy remained in it. A clot of fury accumulated over years of war. It did not want to die. It did not want to surrender to those it had protected. They had to call in a tank. A T-34 was brought up for direct fire and shot a solid shot at the jammed turret rotation mechanism. The impact was terrible. The turret was torn off. It crashed to the ground, punching a deep hole. But even lying on the ground, it continued to tremble, like a severed limb in which nerves had not yet died. The most difficult task was cutting the body. Armor that had withstood German shells now did not yield to peaceful tools. Gas cutters went out. Saw discs flew to pieces, wounding workers. The metal was so oversaturated with tension that when attempting to cut it, it screamed. The sound of the cut sheet was like a human cry. The workers could not endure it psychologically. Riots began. People refused to approach the cursed train. Then they used explosives. They decided not to cut but to blow up the train piece by piece. They placed TNT charges in the joints of the armor plates. The first explosion thundered in the morning. A cloud of dust rose over the depot. When it settled, everyone saw that the car stood completely intact, only slightly blackened. The blast wave passed through it without causing harm, but destroyed a brick warehouse wall 50 meters away. This was already beyond comprehension. Physics did not work here. The train existed in its own reality, where the laws of material resistance were different. Eventually, a solution was found. They brought a special chemical compound, an acid developed for the disposal of chemical weapons. They began pouring it over the hull. The acid hissed, corroding the paint and the upper layer of metal. The train wept rusty tears. The process went slowly, painfully. For weeks, workers removed the armor layer by layer, turning the proud giant into a skeleton.
And as the armor disappeared, so did the anomaly. The rumble subsided, the cold retreated. The train was dying. It surrendered, understanding that its time had passed. But even in disassembled form, in piles of scrap metal, it remained dangerous. Dosimeters near these piles showed strange spikes in background radiation. Now 0, now a lethal dose. This metal could not be melted down together with ordinary metal. It was buried. Yes, you heard that right. The armored train Ilya Muromets was partially buried like radioactive waste, in deep shafts filled with concrete. Where these burial sites are located is a state secret, but they kept the locomotive, the engine, the heart of the train, they decided to preserve as a monument. They washed it, painted it in ceremonial black with red wheels, and placed it on permanent display in Murom Park. It would seem a worthy finale. Heroes in retirement. Children bring flowers. Veterans weep. But even here, the mysticism did not end. Park caretakers told that at night the locomotive breathes. From the cold smokestack comes barely visible smoke. In the firebox, where there is not a gram of coal, crimson reflections sometimes flare up. And in the engineer's cabin, welded shut, a dim light sometimes comes on. Local residents try not to walk in the park after midnight. They say that if you put your ear to the rails on which the monument stands, you can hear the distant noise of battle, the shouts of the crew, and the roar of explosions. The locomotive works like an antenna, receiving signals from the past, from that year of 1944, when it was the king of war. In the 1960s, an incident occurred that nearly cost the first secretary of the regional committee his career. During the Victory Day celebration, wreaths were being laid at the locomotive. An orchestra was playing, speeches were being made. And suddenly, at the moment of the minute of silence, the locomotive gave a whistle. A loud, prolonged, furious whistle, from which pigeons flew up from the entire square, and veterans' hands trembled. No one was in the cabin. There was no steam boiler. The pipes were cut through. Where did the sound come from? A commission searched for hidden speakers, hooligans with tape recorders. Nothing. Officially, they announced that it was a steam release at a neighboring thermal power plant, but everyone knew the truth. Ilya Muromets was saluting his fallen comrades. He remembered them, and he wanted the living to remember them. After this incident, access to the monument was restricted. A fence was put up, and inside the locomotive, all the voids were filled with concrete so that it would finally fall silent. But history cannot be filled with concrete. In the 1970s, when the era of détente and the space race began, interest in Muromets technologies flared up with new force. Soviet scientists were looking for ways to protect spacecraft from radiation and meteorites. Someone remembered the strange armor of the train, its resistance to extreme loads. In the archives, they raised case number 762 and discovered that key pages describing the composition of the alloy and the design of the vibration dampers had been torn out. Who did this? German spies or our special services covering their tracks? A new investigation began. The KGB tried to find those engineers who built the train. It turned out that most of them were no longer alive, and those who were alive remained silent. They were afraid to speak even 30 years later. One old man, a former chief metallurgist of the depot, during interrogation said only one phrase: "We did not invent this metal. We found it. It was given to us." Who gave it? From where? The old man died of a heart attack right in the investigator's office, never revealing the secret. A version appeared that during the construction of the armored train, they used metal from the Tunguska meteorite. Nonsense. Perhaps, but Kulik's expeditions to the area of the meteorite fall in the 1920s and 30s
did indeed bring back some samples. And traces of these samples are lost precisely in the late 1930s, before the war. If we assume that Soviet scientists were able to smelt several tons of armor from celestial metal and used it for an experimental train, then many anomalies find explanation. Both the incredible strength and the strange glow and the effect on time. Meteorite iron, having passed through cosmic cold and atmospheric plasma, could possess properties inaccessible to earthly materials. And Ilya Muromets was not just an armored train, but an artifact that combined earthly technology with something extraterrestrial.
In the 1980s, at the twilight of the USSR, the train was remembered in connection with the development of combat railway missile complexes, the railway-based missile complex Molodets. These ghost trains with nuclear missiles were to become a new embodiment of the idea of elusive power. The designers of the railway-based missile complex studied the camouflage experience of Muromets, its exhaust system, its movement tactics, and they say that one of the chief designers of the railway-based missile complex traveled to Murom, to the monument. He spent an entire night in the closed cabin of the locomotive. What was he thinking about? What was he looking for? Perhaps inspiration? Or was he trying to make contact with the spirit of the machine? After this trip, the development of the missile train proceeded by leaps and bounds, and soon trains appeared on the country's rails that NATO called Scalpel, for their ability to deliver a precise and deadly strike to any point on the planet. Ilya Muromets passed the baton, its DNA, its philosophy of war dissolved into new, even more terrible machines. But there is also another completely conspiratorial line. In perestroika times, articles appeared in newspapers about party gold and secret Central Committee archives. Journalists dug up stories that just before the collapse of the Union, part of the secret documents and valuables were taken away in an unknown direction, and allegedly for this, they used a restored car of Ilya Muromets, the very one that they could not destroy and hid in a burial site. What if they retrieved it? What if it is back in service, but now carries not shells, but the secrets of a dying empire? Witnesses spoke of a black car without windows, which they saw attached to ordinary freight trains going to the Urals or Siberia. A car that is not listed in any waybill. A car from which emanates cold and fear. Perhaps Ilya Muromets still travels along the endless railways of Russia, an eternal wanderer, keeper of secrets that are too dangerous to know and too valuable to destroy. We look at old black and white photos, the faces of soldiers, smiles, an accordion, a pot of porridge. They look like ordinary people, but in their eyes, if you look closely, there is a shadow. The shadow of what they saw beyond the ordinary battle. They were the first stalkers who entered the anomaly zone. They tamed the dragon, but the dragon changed them themselves. And when we say, no one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten, we must remember not only the feat, but also the price that had to be paid for touching the unknown. Ilya Muromets was more than a weapon. It was an experiment that got out of control, but which saved the country. And perhaps, somewhere in a parallel branch of reality, it still races through burning forest, striking terror into enemies. An eternal guardian who never sleeps. In the 1990s, when the Iron Curtain fell, Western researchers flooded into Russia. They were interested in everything: KGB archives, Gulag secrets, secret weapons. They also got to the story of Ilya Muromets. German historian Günter Waltz spent 10 years trying to reconstruct the picture of the battle near Kovel. He found descendants of Adolf Hitler's crew, and in one of the private archives in Argentina, he discovered a letter from a German officer who miraculously did not get on that fateful flight. In the letter, the officer writes to his brother, "Our train is carrying not just bombs, we are carrying the spear of destiny. The Führer believes that if we bring this artifact to the front, the Russians will flee.
But I am afraid this thing is cursed. It demands sacrifices.
The Spear of Destiny, a mystical relic that, according to legend, pierced Christ. Hitler was obsessed with the occult. If we assume that in that lead container was precisely that, then it becomes clear why the battle was so strange. Not just two machines collided, but two forces. The mysticism of the Third Reich and the fury of the Soviet people, embodied in the metal of Muromets. And Soviet steel proved stronger than ancient magic, but contact with the artifact left a mark. Ilya Muromets defeated the dragon, but itself became a bit of a dragon. A strange detail. During the restoration of the locomotive in 1999, workers opened the lining in the engineer's cabin and found a walled-up icon there. An icon of Ilya Muromets, the holy warrior. It was black with soot, but the face was clear. Who put it there? Political officers would have shot someone for such a thing.
So it was done by the workers themselves during construction. They put their soul into the machine, literally.
They blessed this tank on rails, creating a most powerful amulet. And perhaps it was precisely this faith, this spiritual armor, not the thickness of steel, that saved the train from direct hits. The Germans shot at metal, but hit faith. And faith cannot be pierced. This discovery explained much, but also raised new questions. How did communist atheism and deep religiosity combine in the hearts of these people? In war, there are no atheists, and Ilya Muromets became a temple on wheels, where they prayed not with words but with shells, and where the smokestack served as a censer. The story approaches its millennium, the year 2000. The world has changed. Digital technologies, the internet, globalization. Old legends seem like naive fairy tales.
But sometimes in remote corners of the internet, on forums of diggers and adventure seekers, photographs surface, blurry, unclear, taken on a phone at night. On them are abandoned sidings in the Siberian taiga, and in these sidings stands a strange car. It does not rust. There is no graffiti on it. Grass around it does not grow. And if you enlarge the photo, you can make out on the side a half-erased number, 762. A fake, Photoshop. Or is it really waiting? Waiting for when the world again finds itself on the edge of the abyss, and it will again have to raise steam to stand in defense of the last frontier. For heroes do not die. They simply go into reserve until needed. And who knows, perhaps tomorrow we will again hear its whistle, from which the earth will tremble and blood will freeze in the veins of enemies. Whoever they may be,